Okay, now to switch gears. And I'm going to try to get to Jeffrey Sklansky or Professor Sklansky. Ah, here we go. I'm going to unmute you, Professor Sklansky, if that's okay. I'm going to introduce you in the following way, if this is okay. Zerlanga said that U.S. history is like a monetary laboratory. Lots of different things going on historically. And how to approach this. Professor Sklansky did something very interesting. He took a very interesting character from the late 1600s, a minister of all people, and looked about the dilemma a minister had, but also the privileges a minister had and how change could be introduced in terms of monetary thinking. It was insightful and it was new to me, and I learned more about the power of religion in that way. And Professor Sklansky went on, and for every generation going up to the early 20th, had different key individuals, including Biddle, the head of the first bank of the First National Bank, or no, the Second National Bank, excuse me. I stand corrected. So anyhow, it's the sovereign. I was looking for your book to share because I've read it thoroughly and I can't put my hands on it this moment. It's a little too messy here, but Professor Sklansky at the University of Illinois, and we got to meet Money as a Democratic Medium in Boston, and then we got to meet in your office. Thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and it's a privilege and pleasure for me to. I have not had the chance to participate in the American Monetary Institute's conferences before, and I'm really glad to be here and have been learning a lot from the other presentations earlier today. And it's exciting for me to have the chance to talk about some of my work on the history of money with monetary reformers and activists like many of you, and with monetary economists like Sergio Rossi, who we just heard from, and Nicholas Tiedemann and Ronnie Phillips, who are up next. I've been teaching and writing about the history of economic thought and economic relations for many years, but I have too seldom engaged in real dialogue with those who work on the same topics from a different disciplinary perspective, and I feel like I should do this more often. Probably the first thing I ever read about the history of money, long before I decided to study it myself, was the economist John Kenneth Galbraith's popular primer, Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went. In it, Galbraith encourages ordinary readers without economic expertise not to be scared off by the aura of occult knowledge surrounding the subject of money in the modern world. Quote, "The study of money, above all other fields in economics, is the one in which complexity is used to disguise truth or to evade truth, not to reveal it," Galbraith writes, reassuring laypersons that the subject is really a lot simpler than economists make it seem. Well, that has not exactly been my own experience. As I've sought to understand the social significance of money in American history, I've been struck by how much more it meant than modern economics conventionally considers, rather than how much less. Before the turn of the 20th century, Americans didn't generally conceive of money as simply an authorized means of making payments and discharging debts, or a standard legal measure, medium, and store of exchange value. They could not take for granted whence money came or where it went, because many things served as money and money meant many things. In colonial British America, most people conducted the vast majority of their exchanges of goods and services without recourse to cash, even when they kept accounts of the value of what they were trading in pounds, shillings, and pence. When they did need money to buy land, to pay taxes, to purchase things they didn't produce locally, they used a mishmash of common commodities in different regions, like tobacco, beaver pelts, and playing cards, wampum beads from the native communities with which they traded, Spanish coins from the Caribbean and South America, on which different English colonies declared their own so-called proclamation values, English coins, which were always in short supply, and locally issued public bills of credit, about which I'm going to say more in a couple of minutes. Across the Atlantic, the business of banking was emerging in 17th century England, as in Holland and Italy earlier, as court decisions and new statutes authorized goldsmiths to lend their funds out by issuing promissory notes and crediting customers' accounts, and their paper IOUs began circulating like cash. But there were no commercial banks in colonial British America. In the early United States, before the Civil War, amid a chronic shortage of coin, thousands of local banks were authorized to issue their own circulating notes, redeemable on demand in gold or silver specie, and the banknotes served as the preferred medium for paying workers, shopkeepers, and merchants in a burgeoning market economy. The value of each note depended on the reputation of the bank that issued it and how far it had traveled from where it could be redeemed. Even after the creation of a uniform national paper currency and a national banking system in the postbellum period after the Civil War, money remained amorphous and mysterious for many, especially in farm country, where banks and deposits were scarce, even as commercial agriculture was rapidly expanding. Suffice it to say that for 18th and 19th century Americans, money was not merely an economic instrument or resource. It was a fundamental social question, what Americans came to call the money question. And that's the subject of my 2017 book that Stephen referred to, which is entitled Sovereign of the Market, the Money Question in Early America. The money question was posed in different ways in different eras, especially with reference to three successive monetary regimes that the book surveys that were associated with the innovation of public bills of credit issued by elected assemblies in the British colonies, the rise of a decentralized system of commercial banks and banknotes in the early American Republic, and then the ascendance of national banking system and the international gold standard in the aptly named Gilded Age. But from the rise of colonial paper currency to the founding of the Federal Reserve System, the enduring question at the center of public debate was basically this: what should serve as the standard of value and the means of payment? Who should control its creation and circulation? And what principles should govern its role in market relations? For more than 200 years, that question, the money question, shaped American social thought in profound and pervasive ways. According to the Welsh economist Glyn Davies's sweeping history of money since ancient times, quote, in no other country in the history of the world has the subject of money and banking given rise to such long-sustained, deep-rooted, widespread, acrimonious, publicly debated, and eagerly reported controversy as in America. No narrow technical question for academic experts, the money question attracted broad public interest, reaching far beyond commercial and financial circles to provoke wide-ranging debates about religion and science, art and literature, agriculture and industry. The challenge and excitement for me in writing my book came in following the money wherever it led, tracing the movements of such a shape-shifting subject. The money question, it turned out, was about much more than money, which helps to explain both how ordinary Americans without specialized training or expertise were able to engage in sustained debates over monetary theory and policy, and why they did so for so long. So what was ultimately at stake for early Americans in struggles over the constitution of currency? My book makes three basic points about the money question overall. First, I argue that the money question was essentially a political question about power, a question about the expanding authority of money as not only a means of exchange or of payment, but also a means of rule. It's not for nothing that currency typically bears the image of a sovereign, or that the neoclassical architecture of note issuing commercial banks in the early United States came to be modeled on Greek temples with regal white marble columns and porticos like other institutions of governance, draping the business of creating currency and credit in the mantle of the republican state. The power to issue the tokens, tallies, or coins with which subjects could pay taxes, tolls, and tributes to their rulers had traditionally been an essential and exclusive attribute of sovereignty. That power was far more important than the material that the money was made of in establishing a generally accepted means of payment. When locally elected legislatures of small farmers and tradesmen in colonial New England began issuing their own small denomination bills of credit and designating them legal tender for the payment of private as well as public debts, they were making currency a means of self-government as well as a means of local exchange. The power and autonomy that the colonists claimed by producing their own freely circulating means of payment was not lost on the British Parliament, which banned the provincial practice in the 1750s and 60s. And the ensuing American resistance to taxation without representation was closely linked to popular opposition to the tyranny of creditors who controlled the silver currency in which parliamentary taxes had to be paid. After the American Revolution, similar struggles over cash-poor states' creations of their own paper currencies and enactment of legal tender laws, which turned money-making into an instrument of democratic rule and debt relief instead of a scarce asset, prompted the authors of the US Constitution to prohibit state governments from, quote, making anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton made clear what the monopoly of the money supply meant by imposing and enforcing a tax on the whiskey that impoverished farmers used as a local means of exchange a few years later. When thousands of state-chartered commercial banks arose in the new nation, each issuing its own banknotes, redeemable in gold and silver, and lending out far more in paper than they could cash and coin, they were not simply conveying funds from savers to borrowers or substituting bills for bullion. They were creating an expanding currency of banknotes and deposits backed by fractional reserves that bankers controlled, assuming responsibility for managing the money supply on which all Americans relied in a burgeoning market society. What Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri enduringly dubbed the money power in the 1820s meant not only the power of moneyed men in general, but the power of those legally authorized to produce the means of payment and to profit from the interest they charged for access. For early Americans, making money was thus an intrinsically political issue concerning an increasingly vital means of rule. Little wonder that the money question was twin-born with popular politics in colonial America, and that it formed the central issue around which the two-party system coalesced in the Jacksonian era. It was the fundamentally political character of the money question I had in mind in titling my book, Sovereign of the Market. The market in my title brings me to my second main point. Beyond the power to produce money, the money question concerned the rising realm that money came to rule. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans came to conceive of the economy or the market as a discrete domain above and beyond any particular persons, places, or products, indeed any markets in particular, a realm with its own intrinsic rules that governed a growing majority of people's livelihoods as never before. Its early exponents identify the elusive sovereign of the market with the new forms of currency and credit on which ordinary Americans increasingly depended, which they called capital. One basic insight of a rich body of historical scholarship dating back to the 1970s on what's more recently come to be called the history of capitalism is that the rule of capital figured as an open, fiercely contested question rather than a taken for granted premise about progress in early America. And though capital later came to be associated primarily with the employment of wage labor, it's important to recall that in the household economy of 18th and early 19th century America, capital exerted its power over most people's lives in the marketplace, long before the industrial workplace likewise came to constitute its own distinctive sphere under capitalist dictates. So if what we would call capitalism was a question, it was a question about the organization of money as well as about the organization of labor. Indeed, before it was about labor. And even long after most Americans became accustomed to being paid for their labors and paying for their subsistence, they persisted in treating the mode and means of payment as an urgent political question rather than a foregone conclusion. I think that's why the subjects of money and banking gave rise to such long sustained and deep-rooted conflict in America, as Glenn Davies put it. And one purpose of my book is to show that the labor question and the money question went together for 19th century Americans, forming flip sides of the question of capitalism in the discourse of labor leaders and currency crusaders alike, from the working men's movement of the 1820s and 30s to the populist movement of the 1880s and 90s. So too, while previous scholars have produced separate literatures on successive episodes in the long life of the money question, from colonial conflicts over paper currency to the so-called bank wars of the Hamiltonian and Jacksonian eras to the agrarian battles over the gold standard in the Gilded Age, my aim in the book is to trace its trajectory across the whole epoch that historians have charted as the transition to capitalism in America, exploring the centrality of the protracted struggle over the constitution of modern money to capitalist development. In so doing, I've hoped to show that the question at the core of the controversy was not whether Americans were for or against the expanding domain of the market, which most monetary reformers on all sides and across the centuries both assumed and endorsed. The lasting, searing struggle was rather over the composition and control of the means of market relations, namely currency and credit. Nowadays, most people, although not the participants in this conference, I would say, have come to take money itself so much for granted that it's tempting sometimes to view the debates over paper and coin, state banks and the national bank, bimetallism and the gold standard as essentially a long-running contest for money, rather than a conflict about what money really or rightly was. And it's fair enough to say that for many Americans then as now, the most pressing question about money was how they could get it, not how it was created to begin with. But currency campaigns were not simply spurred by the desire for more money, or what the 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter derisively called the servant girls economics. As much as it was a sought after resource, money was also an intensely fought over ideal, like the market as a model of social relations more broadly. The long struggle over the production and distribution of the means of payment amounted to more than a clash of economic interests as we understand them in monetary terms today. It was a conflict over the conception of those monetary terms themselves. And with that in mind, I've approached the topic from the perspective, as Stephen suggested, from the perspective of intellectual history, examining early Americans' conflicting efforts to make tangible the intangible, personal the impersonal, and visible the invisible hand that ruled the growing market realm. Each of the book's 3 sections takes as its thematic focus a multifaceted problem of political and economic power with which the money question came to be identified, each delineating a different dimension of the emergence of the market as an ostensibly self-regulating system. The book thus considers the money question in turn as a question of circulation, raised by the advent of paper money in the colonial era, a question of representation related to the development of commercial banking between the Revolution and the Civil War, and a question of association tied to the rise of the national banking system and the international gold standard in the late 19th century. My third main point about the money question overall is that it divided Americans along class lines. I don't mean that their class positions determined their ideas about monetary theory and practice. I mean rather the converse. Conflicts over currency created new class divides as well as new forms of social solidarity. I suggested earlier that the marketplace rather than the workplace formed the main terrain of conflict over the rising power of capital prior to the emergence of a large propertyless labor force. In early modern England, as the great historian E.P. Thompson argued a few decades ago, such struggles focused on the artificial scarcity and rising prices of food, fuel, and access to land. In the American colonies, by contrast, the broader distribution of land and representation in provincial assemblies enabled family farmers and artisans to ally with middling traders and aspiring gentry in laying claim to the legal machinery for authorizing and issuing money itself. The money question that arose from that radical experiment formed the crucible of class conflict in early America. And even after the United States followed the British model of commercial banking and the specie standard, movements of farmers and workers long continued to challenge monopoly control over currency and credit. In England, writes John Kenneth Galbraith, the triumph of Ricardo's moneyed class was complete or nearly so. In the United States, he continues, it was subject to the sharpest of challenges. In one form or another, this challenge was to dominate American politics for the first century and a half of the Republic, unquote. I should hasten to note that many historians, from whom I've learned a great deal, would be skeptical of my conflation of class and currency struggles. Leading scholars of the money question have more often emphasized how the politics of money crossed or blurred class lines, as it often did. Social historians of class struggle, conversely, have typically treated money as a sign rather than a source of the transformation of class relations, which are often supposed to be determined by the mode of producing wealth, not the means of exchanging it. I don't want to wade into the weeds of these theoretical as well as empirical arguments here, but I do want to suggest that they partly reflect different definitions of class. And I believe I'm using the language of class roughly the way that early Americans did, as they persistently applied it to the money question. The modern concept of class arose on both sides of the Atlantic in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Quote, the essential history of the introduction of class as a word which would supersede older names for social divisions, writes the literary historian Raymond Williams, relates to the increasing consciousness that social position is made rather than merely inherited, unquote, or that new structures create new societal divides. Among the earliest articulations of class in this fluid and fertile sense came, according to Raymond Williams, in the famous discussion of factions in James Madison's Federalist number 10, from which I'd like to quote, this is Madison, those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government, unquote. Madison found his main example of contemporary class division in what he called the, quote, rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, or for an equal division of property. In other words, in the money question of the 1780s. As Americans across the political spectrum came to understand it in this way, class meant essentially a political formation based on property relations. And like Madison, contemporaries invoked the language of class most immediately to describe conflicts over the emerging monetary order, affirming that recurrent battles over bills and banks manifested an underlying struggle between cash-poor households and moneyed men, between producers and patricians, indeed between labor and capital, as those terms were commonly used. The pervasive class rhetoric reflected the recognition that the mode of issuing money played a central part in determining the structural positions within which people increasingly earned their living by buying and selling, lending and borrowing, and earning and saving. Which leads me to a concluding thought. In recent years, as Joseph Huber and many other speakers at this conference have already suggested, the conditions may have emerged for a revival of the money question in new form. The current era marks the twilight of the age of paper money and the specie standard, begun 3 centuries ago. The official ending of the gold standard of the United States in 1971 and the ascendance of electronic payments since then herald to many contemporary observers the coming of an increasingly cashless society. Along with new methods of payment based on conventional currencies like dollars and euros, a growing range of alternative currencies and credit networks have arisen outside the auspices of national governments and banks, including local exchange trading systems and digital currencies like Bitcoin. Interest in alternatives to standard money has surged since the global financial crisis of 2008, reflecting a broader loss of confidence in the partnership of government and banking across the political spectrum. Such experiments have created an opening for renewed debate on both sides of the Atlantic about the modern monetary order that originated in England and America between 1700 and 1900. From libertarian appeals for privately issued currency to be freed from state sponsorship and supervision, to social democratic demands for a fully public currency spent rather than lent into circulation without the intervention of banks, rising theoretical and political challenges have called the social basis of money into question once again. Most recently, many countries around the world have begun experimenting with the creation of digital currencies minted and managed by central banks, a topic several speakers here discussed this morning. And the US Federal Reserve is likewise considering creating a public virtual currency that would come from offering accounts to the general public at the central bank itself. The debate over the digital dollar is ultimately about whether the production of money should be a business run for private profit or a resource owned and operated by the public. Recent proposals mark a revival of the contest between these contrasting visions, which began a century before the federal government and American banking were born. Much as early American politics was preoccupied with debates over what money was made of, gold or silver, coins or bills, current discussions often focus on the promise and peril of cyber currency, mobile banking, stable coins, and other electronic means of payment. Yet what is really at stake is not financial technology, but financial democracy. Now as then, what matters most is not the material form of money, but who makes and manages it. And I'll stop there with thanks again for your attention. And I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Sklansky. We only have a few moments, and
I apologize for that.
no, that's good. There's, I think, a lot more history. You've caught the tenure of us being at the present moment with there an opening now to revisit everything. And so when your characters are questioning life and how things should go forward, we're very much in the middle of a climate crisis and a monetary crisis and a justice crisis and a distribution and ill distribution. And we're wondering, not only as a nation, but as a world, how to go forward. And we've been wrestling with that. And I would need more time to get into it, but I'm going to first let Don get in a question. He had his hand raised early, and we may have to put more questions down for later. Don, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm from Positive Money, New Zealand, and I was first drawn to monetary reform by watching Bill Still's documentary in 2010, The Secret of Oz. He covered the history of US money. Do you have any comment? Well, first of all, have you seen the documentary? And if
I have not. Sounds interesting.
Okay, well then that answers my question then.
Sorry about that. A lot has been, I gather that it is it's riffing on The Wizard of Oz, which of course was in some ways an allegory that had to do with populism and the money standard and the yellow brick road and Emerald City and so on.
Yes, I wasn't necessarily asking for your comments on the metaphor between the battle between gold and silver, but rather the historical narrative that he portrayed, because it really got me activated. And it's his fault that I then formed Positive Money New Zealand out of frustration and being overwhelmed by the gravity of what I was up against. So
I'm going to look it up. What's the last name? The author's last name?
Bill Still, The Secret of Oz.
Okay.
It goes for about 2 hours. It's an hour and a half. It's
okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, we're 1 minute over now.
Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Professor Sklansky. And tomorrow we're going to speak about parity and in farmers and the agrarian life of the last 80 years, but we're going to jump back into a little bit of the history, late 1800s. And I know that group may have some questions. If you're not present, I'm going to start noting questions and we'll send them to you too. So,
all right, it's really a pleasure, and I apologize for going a little over. So,
no, it's all good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If this video is helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website